Hello, this is Nick Holland with Information Security Media Group. This morning's session is entitled Cloud IAM Enlightenment or Expletive. This is by Rapid7. We have Alex Corstorphine, who is Lead Solutions Security Engineer at Rapid7. And we have Jeremy Snyder, who's a Senior Director of Corporate Development. Just a little about today's session. Strong identity and access management is one key area to providing data breaches and limiting the blast radius should a security incident occur. But Cloud IAM presents a new set of constructs for organizations to build and manage. Is Cloud IAM the best identity and access control ever, or yet one more reason to tear your hair out in frustration? Again, a bit moot for myself, but anyway, Jeremy and Alex, please, over to you, and let's hear more about it.
Thanks, Nick. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and we're happy to share on this topic. So just a little bit about myself and Alex, and hopefully the audience is able to see our slides here as we go through this presentation. Alex and myself, we both come from a cloud background. I myself have been doing kind of nothing but cloud for about the last 10 years. And I've really spent my time focusing on helping customers understand the differences in cloud from how it's different from their on-premise infrastructure or environments that they might be migrating from, and how they need to think about security differently. Alex, I'll let you say a few words about yourself, and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be here as well. Been in the cloud space for a while as well, not as long as Jeremy, but about 5 years on my side. But I've had the pleasure of being very focused on the cloud security side of things there. And so I'm really looking forward to arguing about IAM today.
Awesome. Well, speaking of security, I think one of the things that, just to kind of frame any conversation around the shift to the cloud that I've experienced from the cloud side and you've experienced from the security side, is that it really changes the way organizations have to work. And in particular, we think about what I like to call unplanned digital and workforce disruption. And I think there's never been a time where that phrase is as appropriate as right now. And, really what we've been living for the last, 11 months of kind of lockdown at this point, that was unplanned, and it's really transformed the way that our workforces operate, everything from where they work to how they work to what tools they're using. And that, when we ask our customers, what are you doing to deal with these circumstances? The number one answer that comes back is cloud. They're moving applications to the cloud. They're moving workloads to the cloud. They're effectively using the cloud to enable the operations to keep moving in whatever shape they are. And what we think about from Rapid7's perspective is we think about helping customers close what we like to call the security achievement gap. That gap is what happens when you have these kinds of unplanned changes where you weren't able to design security controls or policies or approaches before you started adopting those technologies, right? So another way of thinking about it is that you started using things before you planned for how you were going to use them securely. And Alex, I'm sure, the customers that you've been working with over the last the last 11 months or so, this has been a theme that you've been hearing over and over again is we don't know what we're doing in cloud security. Is that right?
Yeah, and even longer, but to your point, it's been definitely focused more recently is, at the end of the day, with unlimited time, resources, and money, we could get there. But that's not the world that we live in. And so as the world rolls on and these companies are trying to innovate more and bring on new tools, trying to balance doing it right while also not getting in the way of the business is really a hard balance that people are trying to find.
Yeah, absolutely. I can definitely see how that would be the case. I think if we think about kind of this shift, prior to pandemic even, I know you mentioned that it's been something that customers have struggled with even prior to the pandemic. I go back to my days running data centers, and I think about, the security approach that we had there. And it was primarily focused on what I like to think of as just perimeter protection. That's like the core strategy that we're using top to bottom is we want to keep bad actors, we want to keep threats, we want to keep anything undesirable out of our network. And primarily we did that with network security controls like firewalls. And I gather from, time that I've spent in the cloud and from, kind of the more hands-on cloud security experience that you bring to this, that is not necessarily an appropriate paradigm to think about in a cloud context, because that perimeter kind of changes or moves or doesn't really exist. So talk to us a little bit about how you think about talking to customers about where they should be applying kind of border controls or checks around their environments?
Yeah, everywhere. If you look at this, the networking challenge hasn't gone away, but there's new challenges and new layers and dimensions that you need to deal with as well. You move up to the cloud, and there's a number of services that are not controlled by your standard networking constructs. We can't just take a service and always just slap a firewall in front of it and call it good. But I think beyond that, even coming back to the network side of things, regardless of what service it is that I'm looking at, you have this umbrella of IAM over the top of everything. Mm-hmm. And with that, something that we didn't have in the data center is there's not just one root account that could get popped on the data center side that now compromises everything. But that concept is here now. And so regardless of how perfectly I've configured my network and all these other services, if I don't have that top layer locked down, everything can still be for naught in this new world.
Yeah. So kind of two key concepts from what you just said there, right? And I want to summarize and make sure that I'm hearing you right. One is that some concepts definitely still do port across. So we do still have a concept of a firewall or something that looks like a firewall. And we should definitely continue to use those core, let's call them the fundamental building blocks that we've been using for security for a long time. But at the same time, we also have new constructs that overarch all of that and might have the ability to make modifications to those fundamental building blocks. Does that kind of summarize it accurately?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about that identity umbrella that you just mentioned here. And I wanted to kind of get your help in helping our audience understand how this works. And I know this image may be a little bit hard to read on screen here, but for anybody who's interested, we've taken this from AWS documentation. So you're certainly able to go out and just Google something like AWS IAM, I don't know, diagram or something like that, and you'll find this and be able to look at it in greater detail. But talk to us, Alex, about how does that IAM umbrella apply? And then how do you think about trying to figure out what is or is not allowed in this identity construct?
Yeah, it's funny. There's a lot of data on that diagram and it turns into a bit of an eye chart, but I think that initial kind of looking at it and reeling going, oh, that looks complex is actually pretty accurate because even once we go and break this down, it doesn't get any easier. At the end of the day, there's just a ton of different layers within IAM that all need to come together to truly define where access is granted. And I think that's where a lot of the opportunity, but more often than not, a lot of the challenge lies. Mm-hmm. Because as you're looking at this, basically we've got account level permissions, we've got organization level permissions, which are one level higher. But then as you go kind of back down, we have users and we have roles, which are essentially users, but without people backing them, if you will. And then for each of those users or roles, we can then attach different principles, we can attach conditions. And after we bring all of those different permissions together, on top of that, now we're needing to deal with services that can have permissions attached as well. So, beyond just talking networking or services or anything like that, just looking at IAM, there's some like 10 different layers of places that these permissions can be attached to define who can do what where.
Mm-hmm. So again, if I think about kind of, some of the fundamental building blocks, it sounds like some of them are still in here when we talk about, let's say users and groups and roles. And we can go think about kind of, classic role-based access control that we've got in our data centers, in our Active Directory, in our other environments. And we should still be following best practices when it comes to just, overall RBAC, like let's do RBAC well, let's not give everybody, admin permissions, right? That's not something we want to do. So we've got that, but then we've got these additional complexities and we're going to get into some of those. But first, does that kind of accurately represent, how this cloud IAM should be approached?
Yeah, classic concepts plus a bunch of new stuff kind of layered on top of it, definitely.
Got it. And then if we go back to, let's say, the fundamental question that we start this presentation with, is this Enlightenment or is this Inferno? Where do you stand on that question?
I'm on the Inferno side. Again, coming back to unlimited resources, time and money. Sure, we have the opportunity to get this perfect, But in reality, there's too much complexity where instead we generate a lot of opportunities to get things wrong.
I might sit on the other side of that, and we'll have to kind of debate that out as we go here, because I know, one of the frustrations I had from running data center days was that it was difficult with traditional RBAC to get the exact right level of permissions to each user for the access that they needed. And I always wished I had more kind of levers to pull to tweak those permissions in ways that I needed. So I'm wondering if, the new complexities that you mentioned might actually just be new opportunities for me to tune things the way I want. So let's dive in a little bit deeper. Let's talk about kind of this evaluation. You mentioned these kind of, let's say, things that don't necessarily, don't necessarily have users attached to them. Let's talk about this. I see here, this lower diagram talking about a credential being attached to an instance. What's that all about?
Yeah. So normally I've got my user, I've got my, username and password as, how I might go and log into a system. But what about times where we have certain services that need their own level of access to other places? If I've got an instance trying to talk to storage, it doesn't make sense to throw a person in the middle trying to log in every time, those two systems need to interact. And so for those types of use cases is where roles come in, where we can essentially delegate those permissions without having a person attached to it. And with that, again, I think that piece does solve a use case where we need to take people out of the permissions model sometimes. But at the same time, then it brings in, again, a whole nother dimension of where things can go wrong, because now, we've got that role, whether or not it's perfectly scoped, but if the role is attached to an instance, now I'm not just looking at usernames and passwords as far as where I need to secure things, but if that instance has a vulnerability and gets compromised, then they've got access to that role.
Yeah, this is, this sounds to me a lot like the evolution of the service account, but to your point, we take kind of the user account out of the service account, but it's a way for services to communicate with each other. I can see a little bit of elegance here because, to your point, it does take the user out of the equation. But I can also see some complexity in the sense that, these have to be managed like any other role, right?
Yeah. And kind of coming back to the all the knobs that you've been wanting for in your data center days, the knobs are there and we can scope things down however we want, but it's extremely complex. And even fundamentally, the places that these permissions are defined are in many different places. So it's not like I can even just give you a 10-page document saying, here is all of your access. You have, all these different consoles and locations and everything that you need to go and aggregate together to start to understand what these roles and users can do.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about those places and where those permissions live, because, I've heard you say a couple things, right? So we've got user accounts. It sounds like we also have permissions associated with services. Earlier, you were talking about, account level permissions as well as organizational level permissions. So like fundamentally, what's the lens that somebody should use to try to apply and figure out like, what is it that can be done here? Is it kind of an overlap of these things? What is this diagram all about here?
Yeah. That effective access at the center is kind of the punchline of, okay, it really is the overlap of everything that we need to care about. When I talk to my customers, I really recommend taking kind of a meta approach and then getting more specific as they kind of have more time to get the fundamentals right. For instance, those service control policies or SCPs, top level account or organization level permissions where we can just say, you cannot do these certain things. That's a great place to start. Blacklist services that aren't allowed to be used, explicitly say which regions we cannot deploy things in, and make sure to go and set up those kind of less granular guardrails. And then from there, lock down our services, lock down our users, and kind of take it down further. And I think ideally with that, eventually you'll end up where you were trying to get to, which is we have these users where we can be very specific about what they can and can't do. I think in reality, what you're going to see is actually getting all the way down the line there of having all those other fundamentals locked down is where you're going to end up getting stuck at any, especially at any enterprise sort of scale.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you mentioned the line, because actually the very next thing I wanted to talk about is this line. And, I think about, kind of, let's say, more simple environments like data centers and, co-location facilities where I might be using virtualization like VMware or Citrix or something else. And I've got, a pretty basic set of, let's say, calculations that get performed when I try to log into a system or I try to access some data or something, right? It's fundamentally, what account am I using? What groups is my account a member of? What permission sets or roles are those groups associated with? And, I go through that calculation. But, along the lines of what you were just saying there, you talked about these SCPs, you talked about, identity policy and so on. It sounds like there's extra steps that get applied in these cloud environments. And again, those sound compelling to me, but maybe there's some complexity in them that I'm just starting to understand. So talk us through, kind of the evaluation decision for a request being allowed or denied.
Yeah, let's pick on just a couple of these here. At the end of the day, if you're one user with one instance, one account, and one region, and you're just trying to lock down IAM for yourself, you can do it. There's not that many knobs to turn. It's just on one. The challenge is in the exponential growth of complexity as the number of users grows, as well as the number of applications that you're running in your different environments. So, with that, SCPs, I think, are one of the easier things to manage because they're so overarching. But now we have to manage that at our organization level, different console. One down the line, resource-based policies. Now, we're only 2 steps into these permissions and things start getting very ridiculous very fast. Because with SCPs, I've got one place to go. With resource-based policies, let's say there's 10, maybe 20 different services, at least on the Amazon side now, that can have their own base policy, their own identity policies. Well, if you've got 20,000 different services or different instances of these services running in your accounts, which is frequently on the low side for the customers we talk to, there's no central console for that. You need to go and aggregate all of those permissions for every single resource to just even get to step 2. And then from there, again, we need a set of permissions, boundaries, session policies, identity policies. Those, again, are a little bit more on the aggregate side. But again, depending on the number of users, the complexity just increases so much that just understanding what's going on, period, is hard enough, let alone starting to really be able to ask informed and complex questions about who can do what where.
I think I'm starting to see your side of this a little bit, just knowing the number of calculations. And I'm curious, like, from what you've seen out in the world, this question about these SCPs, I like what you said, that they're simple, they're easy to understand because they are overarching. Can you talk a little bit about the level that they're applied at? And because it sounded like, there's an account construct and there's an organization construct. What's the relationship there? And then secondly, like, how are you seeing customers use cloud today? Because I assume, if I've just got one account, that's fine. But is there like a scale question or a number of accounts question where this starts to become more difficult?
Yeah. Everything gets harder at scale. Especially over the last couple of years, we've seen a shift in how the cloud providers recommend you deploy your accounts. Okay. Historically, it was take one or just a handful of accounts and throw all your applications in there, and then you can kind of use the account as your perimeter. And that had its upsides, it had its downsides. But long story short, nowadays, the providers have essentially 180'd on their position. They're saying accounts are now a much smaller unit of measurement, and you should have one account per, per team, per application, per anything like that. And so, the number of customers we have with one account is 0, if not very close to 0. Instead, you see customers with 50, 100, 1,000, a couple thousand accounts. Mm-hmm. And so even that umbrella of permissions becomes hard to manage, because just even grouping that number of accounts into different buckets where we limit permissions is just hard with that many to deal with.
And then, to your point, if these things are in different consoles between the organization, where the SCP lives, and then the account level, and like you said, I've got tens or hundreds of these accounts and I need to aggregate that. Yeah, that becomes problematic. I mean, I think one of the things everybody that I know that's done a long career in cybersecurity, you ask them what are fundamentals, and one of the things that always comes back is simplify as much as possible and reduce the number of locations that you have to go look for things. And so it sounds like that the cloud environment is kind of pushing people away from that problem, or at least dramatically increasing the number of places that they have to go query to bring back that data. So let's try to summarize this for a second here, and then I want to talk about some solutions, because you're laying out a scenario that doesn't sound great from a customer management perspective, but there have got to be some ways to kind of get this right. So summarize for us. Okay, so we've got different ways to specify access. Looks like we've got 5. We know that we've got kind of those SCPs that you talked about. We've got standard role-based access control. We've got permissions boundaries. We've got sessions, and we've got identity-based policy. Each of those has its own kind of, let's say, decision mechanism in this flow chart that we represent here. What is this no human-friendly way to understand true access? What does that mean? What's that all about?
Yeah, it comes back, I think, a lot to even the not only the multi-console challenge that we were talking about, but even once you end up with the data all in one spot, then there becomes even more effort that needs to be put into computing true access, from taking the allows, taking the denies, taking the conditions, and really aggregating them all together. And and yeah, it's not that it's impossible, but it's definitely beyond unfriendly to try to do it for even one particular user role.
And I understand these roles, just even understanding them on their own, they've got these policy documents that are kind of syntactically complex just to start off with, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's everything about it's hard.
All right. Well, I'm coming around to your way of thinking here. So let me throw some challenges at you, and just give us some quick ideas about approaches that might work. So we talked about this decentralized management where we don't have this source of truth. So what's an approach that customers could think about there?
Yeah, I think the most basic thing to do is something I talk about a lot, not even on the IAM side, but really as a fundamental cloud challenge that you need to overcome, is take all of this data, take all of these different consoles, and bring it into one space. If we can't have one place to go and look at a source of truth, period, we can't do anything down the road. So centralize this data and be able to look at one place and start to ask questions. And from there, everything else can build off of it.
Just like I said a minute ago, minimize and centralize your information. Exactly. All right. Second one, what about no awareness of IAM permissions abuse?
Yeah. I think there's 2 pieces here. First is, if we have no definition of good in the first place, then how do I know if something's being abused? Because I don't even know what acceptable use is. So, try to get to least privilege, define what users in certain teams and whatnot should be doing. And then from there, once we know what our good looks like, then setting up that monitoring to say, okay, well, now that we know what good is, let me know if something bad happens.
Makes sense. It sounds like that approach might also help with our next challenge, which is, I hear that self-escalation of privileges is something that companies are worried about, where Alex, because of some association that he has the ability to grab more permissions than he really needs, and it sounds like that monitoring might help uncover for that scenario as well.
Yeah, I think this is essentially a more specific example of one type of IAM permission abuse.
Yeah, fair enough. And we talked about kind of resources and the fact that resources can have identity. And I know one of the challenges that I've heard is that in my data center environments, I know what everything is, right? But at these cloud environments where things change more quickly, how do customers know what belongs to whom? What's your recommendation there?
Yeah, I think what it says there, the tagging standards is classic. And again, kind of coming back to, even without IAM, you have to know what's going on in these environments, because kind of like bringing all the data together. If I bring all the data together, but I have no idea what these resources are that I'm seeing, it makes it very hard to ask any questions down the road.
Yeah, makes sense. This next one is one that I have to say is something that, generally speaking, everybody that I know in the data center world is terrible at. Like, once we deploy something into a data center, we're really reluctant to go shut it off unless it's like really end of life or decommissioned. But it sounds like that's something that, cloud lends itself to very well. So what would you recommend to customers here when you've got, kind of like junk or clutter in your environment?
I think this one comes a lot more back to the organization side of things. Anyone can go and delete an instance that we see as a month old, but has the organization said, I'll support you if you go and do that? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. So I think, define the policies for your organization as far as how long resources can live. What do you do when you find things that are out of compliance? And then from there, the execution part of it almost becomes the easy piece.
Yeah, fair enough. And then on bad developer experience, I hear this is one of the biggest points of frustration for developers using cloud environments, is that this experience is bad.
Yeah, it is. We've got all those different layers coming together. And I think there's always going to be some give and take between a security team and a dev team of locking things down as tight as possible while, still being able to get work done. And so I think communication is definitely key. I think education is a big one, because if people don't know why they should even care, then, hey, give me star. I'm trying to get my job done and leave me alone.
Yeah.
It becomes an answer that you hear. But if people get that there's kind of a middle ground that needs to be found, I think everybody's going to be happier.
Yeah, makes sense. And then IAM consistency across accounts and organizations. It sounds like SCPs would be one of the solutions here. What else?
Yeah, I think it comes back a lot to even like the time to live policies, 2 lines up here, which is make a plan. That security achievement gap is continuing to grow, but it is so much harder to change the wheels on a moving car. As much as possible, as complexity grows, as your team adopts more cloud, try to get ahead of it, try to establish some policies and really set yourself up for success, because once you're already deployed and things are just going along, it is so much harder to change.
Yeah, makes sense. It sounds like, look, if we had to summarize it, it's complex. There's a lot of, kind of weird newness in all this cloud identity stuff, but it sounds like it doesn't have to be. There are solutions, there are approaches that have been proven out. And I think, what I would hope to leave the audience with is take some of those ideas, to your own cloud environment, if that's something that'll help you. And if you're ever interested in learning more, please do feel free to reach out to us here at Rapid7. We are really focused on helping customers close that security achievement gap and really, gaining the security that you need in order to make the transition, whether it's because of the pandemic, whether it's because cloud is just your organization's future, what have you. Feel free to check us out. DivvyCloud by Rapid7, a product that Alex and his team are well aware of, and they can help walk you through, help you understand how it can keep you safe from misconfigurations, which are the #1 source of data breaches, some of these identity and access management problems that we just talked about, and other problems like policy violations, threats, and compliance challenges to make your organization successful in its cloud adoption. With that, Nick, thank you so much. I think we've gotten through everything we hope to get through today. I don't know if we have any time left for questions, but we'd love to hear them if there are any.
I think we're actually hit the bottom of our 30 minutes. So that's certainly, I'm sure that people will have some questions who've been on this actual session. So please do submit them to the folks at Rapid7 here. Jeremy and Alex, I think, Alex, you made a very convincing case. Seems like Jeremy has been won over by your winning argument there. So I want to thank, obviously, Jeremy Snyder and Alex Corstorphine from Rapid7 for this very informative session. And folks, please do enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you very much.